So now we're going to do a careful and a critical analysis of the dimensions of literacy pedagogy. So we're going to look at the content of literacy knowledge that happens in this framework of didactic pedagogy. We're going to look at how the literacy curriculum is organised, and we're going to look at the ways in which learners do literacy, and we're going to look at the social relationships of literacy learning in this kind of a classroom.
What does this pedagogical choice, didactic pedagogy, mean for literacy? We've already discussed that literacy means being able to read and write, and of course it generally is related to also speaking and listening or some form of meaning making. Typically, didactic pedagogy involves the following kind of components. Grammar, and typically that involves labels for the way in which the order and the type of words are selected make meaning. Vocabulary, the number of words that any person has for expressing and making meaning. This is a very important area, and there's a lot of data and research at the moment that suggests that different peoples from different backgrounds have smaller or larger vocabulary attached to their way of making meaning. Phonics is another component to didactic pedagogy. It stresses the link between sound and speech and how words are formed from letters. The literary canon is another component. It's about what matters, what kind of things are considered best writing. And of course, this decision is a cultural decision, but in every society, some texts come to the top because those who make decisions or are associated with judging writing decide that some kind of writing is better than other writing. For example, that the novel Moby Dick is better than a newspaper writing or other kinds of expressions in some other form. And of course, reading is another component of didactic pedagogy, and this is much involved with fluency and the flow of words being sounded out and sentences being articulated. And finally, comprehension, the degree to which a reader or a listener comprehends any particular kind of text and the way it makes meaning. Together again, the focus on these elements in literacy didactic pedagogy form an ecology, the living learning nexus that this approach produces. And typically, the kind of effect that it has is that it requires experts and apprentices. That is, those who know are in control and those who don't know have to learn from the experts. It involves authority and followers, so questions of validity and value are not terribly relevant in didactic pedagogy. It's those who have authority who determine what is good for the learner. And finally, of course, this produces a singular frame of meaning that is determined by those who know more or who know better. It's rare in didactic pedagogy that the learner might decide what they need for themselves or have the power or the capacity to determine the cultural values around any particular kind of text. So the ecology that this produces is one of uniformity, one of acquiescence, one of doing as you're told, and one that involves you to learn in a common way with the others around you.
So now we're going to look in some detail at the contents of literacy knowledge. What's being taught in the curriculum of didactic literacy pedagogy? Well, here are some of the things. One is a set of formal rules, and here are some formal rules. There are 44 different sounds in English, in the English language, and there are 26 letters. And the relationship in English between these sounds and letters is a bit messy, it's a bit complicated, unlike other European languages, for instance, where it's relatively straightforward. In English, it's messy. So we have to learn a whole lot of rules, phonics rules, about the relationships of sounds to letters. This is what we do in beginning literacy. There are single sounds that can be represented by different letters. There are single sounds that can be represented by combinations of letters, diphthongs and the like. So we have to learn these rules. The other thing we have to learn in terms of formal rules is we have to learn how to spell, which again in English is not straightforward because there's all kinds of messy irregularities along the way. And the other thing we have to learn is traditional grammar, right? So we learn, and by the way, what we do in school is we talk about rules, about singular and plural and verbs agreeing with nouns in terms of singular and plural, that kind of stuff. So we can talk about grammar in these kinds of ways. So in other words, we consider literacy as something which in the first instance is about learning some rules. The second thing that's in this issue of the contents of literacy knowledge is we learn correct forms of usage. There's one set of spellings, there's one set of pronunciations, there's one standard English, and that's what we're going to learn. Now, in fact, out there in the world, there are all sorts of dialects, there are all sorts of variations in the world, but we're going to bracket them all aside in order to learn one standard version of the language. The other thing we want to do as well is we might do some reading for meaning, but how do we understand meaning in this environment? Well, what we understand meaning is a single thing that the author intended to say. So in other words, if we do a comprehension test, we get to the questions at the end of the reading text, and there are right and wrong answers to these questions. It's not a matter of, what's your interpretation and what's your perspective and what do you think's going on. And in fact, what we do is, because we can't ask that kind of question, we often ask in reading comprehension quite narrow questions like, what day did the activity happening, or, whatever. And in fact, to answer them, they're often not the main thing that engages you. You've got to go back and read the text to find the answer. But the important point is, what's the implicit assumption behind this notion of reading? The implicit assumption is that the author has one message and you've got to work out what that message is. There's not much room for interpretation. Now, the other thing we want you to do in this kind of literacy is we want you to appreciate the literary canon. There are great books. Even in children's literature, there are great and important books. But certainly as you become older and you work your way through the school, we want to make sure you understand Shakespeare. We want you to understand the great national writers of the particular country that you come from. And these are people who've expressed, supposedly, and perhaps they have to some significant degree, the essence of a literary tradition, the essence of a human tradition. And we want you to revere that. We want you to respect that and consider, this is the heights of doing English as a subject or English language arts, to respect this literary canon. So this is what I've been doing here is just a short thumbnail sketch of the contents of literacy knowledge.